Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Best of Pedalshift. I hope everybody's inside, staying happy and healthy. This edition of the Best of Pedalshift, we are revisiting the Pedalshift project number 048, a Brompton, California bike tour. You know, I was supposed to be on a Brompton, California bike tour of my own, but of course things changed out a little bit. So, this is a good thing to maybe revisit. This was originally podcast on April 28th, 2016, and it covers my first real tour that I did using my Brompton, going through Northern California and Big Sur with my backpack setup and everything that went along with that. It was a really tremendous ride, and it really opened my eyes to the possibilities of what one can do touring with a Brompton through some terrain that most people don't think that little clown bike can handle, but it can. Hope you enjoy this. We'll see you next week for episode number 200, which will be the first edition of at least 3 parts for my tour last week on the C&O. Looking forward to see you then. But in the interim, here's episode 048, Best of Pedalshift. I'm back. I'm back from a pretty epic ride on the California coast, and this episode is basically chock full of all of my experiences from this really fun, really nice California coastal ride. It was not the first time I've ever done this section of the California coast, but I had some really cool new experiences as a result of it. It was the first time I rode this section of the coast with my friend MJ, which was a lot of fun. And just overall, I've got a lot of things to talk about, so I thought I'd take the entire episode to talk about this epic ride. I think first and foremost, I want to thank my companion, MJ, for coming along. He and I, as I've talked about on past episodes, and as he's talked about on the interview episode back at the end of last year, we kind of got into bike touring together at the same time, and we've gone in our own unique directions, but it's always great to ride together, and it was really fun to have him, and it's always good to just be able to talk about all sorts of different types of things. We're sort of cut from the same cloth, even though we don't always hold the same opinions on a variety of things, trust me. But the nice thing is that we're always able to have good, lengthy, awesome conversations about just about anything. And I think that it goes beyond the bike touring aspect as well, which I think is important in camp, because if it's all about bike touring, I think that could kind of wear on you after a little while. But it was really great. So having a good touring companion, I think, can be a really good thing. So if you don't have one, finding one is probably someone that would be really good. That said, I tend to like to bike alone a lot, and I know that MJ does as well. We didn't ride together very much. In fact, we rode together very little. We both like to sort of have our own pace. He tends to be a little faster than me. I was on a Brompton, which was necessarily slower in certain portions than his sort of roll-off hubbed Surly, which is a freaking amazing bike, by the way. So, just having that person that you're going to be hanging with at the end of the day, or even, at lunchtime or running into them at some point further on up, it worked out really well. So I highly recommend, if you can get your own MJ, go ahead and do that, because it's pretty cool. A bunch of the other kind of general things I want to talk about the ride itself. I named my bike 44 a long time ago when I first got it, last fall. And of course, that goes into the whole hashtag sports ball thing. I went to Syracuse and blah, 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 and it's orange and 44 is a big number. I decided that I didn't really like that name very much. And recently, Syracuse basketball great Pearl Washington was diagnosed with brain cancer, and while on the trip, passed away. And I am not really, into kind of nostalgia things, or nostalgia-y, is that even a word? Nostalgic things, or, tributes or things like that. But to a certain degree, I kind of thought that naming the bike Pearl made a lot of sense given everything. It still keeps my little Syracuse thing with it and all the orange and all of that. And if I'm not into tributes, I am, at least in this instance. So the bike's name is Pearl. That bike rode really, really, really well over the course of this trip. I will say it took a couple of days to get the hang of touring on it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next up, sort of generally speaking about the ride, weather was largely outstanding with one exception. And if you followed along at all, you know that we took a 0 mile day in Big Sur, and I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. If you like coastline, just generally, if you like looking at the beach, if you like being on the beach, do yourself a giant favor and ride this section of the California coast. And I would also hesitate to add on the section from Leggett Hill, which is north of San Francisco, starting there and going all the way down through the city of San Francisco and then down to San Luis Obispo. It's a fantastic stretch. It's great for bike touring. There's some challenging parts. There's some great parts, but man, the views you get are just outstanding. And if you followed along and saw some of the pictures I sent, it's simply breathtaking, especially around the Big Sur area. So that's sort of the general stuff. One thing that I would also say, as another general thing, I champion this ride, but I would hesitate for a moment for anybody who does not feel comfortable riding with traffic a lot. I would say this is not a good route for you. California Highway 1 in this section of the California coast has shoulders throughout a lot of it, but not all of it. And some of the gnarlier parts, there are little to no shoulders. And if you're not comfortable kind of coexisting with cars, this is not the ride for you. It's a wonderful ride, and I highly recommend, sucking it up and doing it if you can, if that's something you feel like you can get into. But if you are, simply put, not comfortable around traffic like that, I would say stick to non-traffic touring routes. This is not the one for you. You get some great rewards for it, but if you're nervous about it, you will be constantly freaking out the whole time, especially in certain parts near, the areas of the Central California coast, particularly Big Sur. We'll start off with some of the highlights of the ride. And, honestly, the highlights section could be, 45 minutes long if I really wanted to go off on it. But I'll just start by saying that the big thing about this ride was the fact that this was the first tour that I was doing in earnest on a Brompton. And I'm realizing that I often kind of just say, oh, Brompton, as if everybody knows what that is. A Brompton is a particular brand of touring bike. I shouldn't even say touring bike, a folding bike. I happen to call it a touring bike because of the build that I got. It's made in the UK, and it is, I would say, arguably the highest end of folding bikes. There are definitely other brands out there, Turn in particular, and Bike Friday, that are also mentioned favorably in the same sentence, and I think they're excellent bikes. But I do think that Brompton tends to be considered a cut above all of them. I don't have much to compare it to. I never rode a Bike Friday or a Turn or any of the other ones that are sort of mentioned along with it. But Bromptons have been used for touring before, and I am certainly not the first person to tour on a Brompton at all, but I used and stood on the shoulders of all the people that sort of did that before me. So I'd say the number one highlight is taking this Brompton Pearl, its name is now Pearl apparently, and succeeding in a tour that was one that I've done on a full-size bike before, and a tour that I wanted to do first, not because it was, oh, this is something that the Brompton can handle. It was, no, I want to go and do the Central California coast, and I'm going to happen to bring the Brompton with me. So highlight number one, succeeding on a tour with a Brompton. I think that I picked a pretty challenging ride as the first one. And around Monterey or so, I was questioning whether that was really a good idea or not, because frankly, there are some elements to riding a Brompton on a tour that are a little harder. The geometry is very different. The riding's very different. If you haven't seen one ever, go ahead and Google it and you'll see. I often refer to Bromptons, and I do this with all the love in my heart, as little clown bikes, and they sort of are. I mean, they ride very upright. Their geometry is completely different. It just rides very differently. And frankly, while I've ridden around on it a lot and ridden on other folding bikes a lot, it is a totally different thing to ride around for 10, 15, 20, even 20 miles like I did for the Transit-Aided Tour last year, and doing 50 or 60 miles, and then 50 or 60 miles with some 1,000-foot climbs in there as well. It was a really challenging time, but it worked, and I think that the particular build that I got, making sure that I had low gears on it, really made a big difference. Was I able to ride every single pedal stroke of it? Absolutely not. No, I jumped off and I pushed on a few occasions. I mentioned it before, it'll be more in the Lowlights section, but there was one particular section where I was pushing the bike up a big hill outside of Monterey, and I thought, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to do this. I don't think I've got Big Sur coming up, and I'm huffing and puffing up this thing. Yeah, I found that, as it turns out, that sort of the psychology of riding the Brompton is very much that psychology. And there were some hills that were challenging, and I would be like, why is this so hard? And I got to the point where the mechanic who was over at Clever Cycles, who I was emailing with when I was talking about doing a build, he was like, just get off and push. And I did that a bunch of times, and that honestly made my life a lot easier. I probably jumped off the bike maybe less than a dozen times, probably more than 6, but less than a dozen times. And it made all the difference in the world. There were a few times when it was a hill that I had spun up a similar one right before, similar size, similar steepness. But for some reason, lack of momentum, I was tired, whatever, it just wasn't working. So I'd hop off, I'd push it for a few hundred meters, and then or maybe even less than that. And then I would hop on the bike and everything would be cool again. It was awesome. The other thing about this bike is that it rides really well. I found the Dayhan was a little shaky at times, especially going down hills. And I went down some pretty big freaking hills on this ride, and it was stable and it was great. And it felt just as safe as any other bike. And that was a big surprise. And that was also another kind of sub highlight of succeeding on a tour with a Brompton. Highlight number 2, hanging with MJ again. I think I've already talked about that. I mean, we just had a really good time, particularly on our 0 mile day, where we just sort of quietly sat in a corner at the lodge at Pfeiffer State Park and had a day where we just bought $12 worth of internet and just did our thing while the rain just came pouring down outside. And our tents were set up over in the campground, and we spent another $5 for the day. Meanwhile, there were other people who were continuing on the tour, and they just had a miserable day. They went, maybe 30 or 35 miles up and ended up getting a really expensive cabin in one of the little teeny tiny towns further down the coast. And, we're soaked and wet and miserable. We were warm and dry and happy, and we frankly caught up with them a couple of days later. So in the end, we all did the same trip. We just happened to have different experiences, and hanging out with MJ and having that person who was like, yeah, it's cool, let's take a 0 mile day. That was really helpful there. Next up is meeting Tim of North to North. And I'm going to have a link in the show notes to Tim's blog. What a really incredible journey he's on. He has been going from basically Arctic Circle down to the tip of South Africa, over to the tip around Tierra for South America, and has been working his way up through California. Now he's going to eventually end up in the Arctic Circle in Alaska at some point. Since some of his ride corresponds with what MJ had done in the past, they had a grand old time talking about it. It was cool. We met up, we just random. He was going northbound, we were going southbound. It's like 2 bullets striking each other in midstream. It was really kind of interesting and fun, and he's a really cool guy, and it was really nice to meet him. So check out North to North, and I've got a link in the show notes there. The section from Plaskett Creek, which is a National Forest Service campground, which is south of Big Sur, about a day's ride or so, about 35 miles south. Starting from there, going to Morro Bay, it was a 60-mile stretch. It was probably the best day of riding that I've ever had. We had 2 great big climbs, and I had succeeded that with those before on the Safari on the bigger bike, and I was able to just munch up those hills on that bike, and I was a little curious how the Brompton would handle it. Well, it handled it just fine. I hopped off the bike I think maybe once or twice on the whole thing, but spun up those great big hills and came down those very big hills, as I had talked about before, and just really, really had a great time getting up and down those hills. Then there's kind of this quasi-flat but very rolling section from about San Simeon to Morro Bay, and we had about a 20 or 30 mile per hour tailwind, and it just pushed us along. And it was so fast and so great. I'd been living in the low gears for a day and a half, and to be able to go into the highest gear possible, I should say, and to be able to just get some speed on that little clown bike, man, that was fun. And that was really cool. And the weather was great, and the views were great. And you go by a beach full of elephant seals, and I stopped and took a bunch of pictures there. It was the kind of day you do bike touring for. And to have a day like that was as strong as that had followed a day that I would have said was my best day of biking ever. And it's kind of 2 days in a row, but that one in particular, it was absolutely amazing. Really, really great. Awesome stretch of this route. I mentioned before the 0 mile day in Big Sur. That was another highlight. You'd think that as a bike tourist that taking a 0 mile day would feel, well, a little wrong or a little down, or, oh, the weather's preventing me from being able to cycle. And I have to say that was certainly the case, but at the same time, the experience that we had was really great. It also, frankly, was a day for me to kind of catch up with some rest. I'll talk about it in the Lowlights section, but I had a couple of challenges that day off really, really helped with. And frankly, it was kind of fun to be sitting inside this really nice lodge, and it almost felt like you were kind of cheating a little bit, but at the same time, it was awesome. And download all the podcasts that I needed because I knew that we would have no cell phone signals going forward, and to just be able to enjoy the heck out of it. That was a real highlight. And also, we got to hang out and we had a nice dinner that night. It's better than sort of eating cheese and crackers, which is what I think I was doing the night before. So much better. 0 mile day. Big thumbs up. Last but not least, the views. I shared a lot of pictures along the way. Not all the ones that I took, and I'll be kind of sprinkling those through the Instagram feed and Facebook and elsewhere over the next few weeks, I think, just because there are times when you just sit there and you look out on the vista that's in front of you and you think, how is this real? I mean, this is the type of thing that computers generate. There was one spot in Morro Bay where we're at the Albertsons of all places, right? And we're riding up, and I was looking off in the distance, and I was like, James, that looks like a Microsoft screensaver, doesn't it? And it was just the way the rolling hills looked like. It looked exactly like a Windows XP screensaver. And he was like, huh, weird. It was just kind of strange. And that was sort of like one of the ugliest things that we ever saw on the entire trip. Just the coastline is just magnificent. So cool. And I hope the pictures did some justice. I know they didn't. When I was taking a picture, I'd be like, there's no way that this computer in my hand will possibly be able to register the countless numbers of shades of blue that I'm seeing in the water below me. And it couldn't obviously capture the motion in the same way. I could have taken more videos and things like that, but it just couldn't possibly do it. And that's why I think that the memories from this are as important as anything else. And I'm really glad that I was able to do it a second time to contribute to it. And what else was cool was, as sort of subset of all of this, was there were individual parts. I've talked about this before on the show, where it's maybe a 5-foot section of the road. It's completely nondescript, especially if you're flying by it in a car. You would never notice it. But there's some element of the way the guardrail is shaped and bent, and the look of below you, and the way the plants are. And you realize, I was right here 2 years ago, and I had the exact same kind of moment. And you realize how special that is, and it's something you only get with bike touring. And that was... well, that probably happened a half dozen times on this route. And the other cool thing is that I feel like I maybe made some additional memories. So when I do this section again, I'll remember the tree that I kind of laid in for a little bit that was overlooking the coastline. And, while I had I think I had a nut bar and a bottle of water or something like that, it was just one of those moments that was really kind of cool. And I'm glad that I've got those and I'm collecting them every time I go on these routes. All right. Those are the highlights. Lowlights. There's always lowlights on trips, especially longer ones. I'm happy to say that this was limited in terms of the lowlights, but they were definitely there, and I wanted to talk about them just to share, because I think that there's some good experiences in here that might be helpful for those of you who are thinking about doing this route, or could be transferable to other routes as well. Number one, losing a day of riding due to the rain. Frankly, I talked about that already. I think that was more of a highlight than anything, just because we had a lot of fun. But at the same time, it prevented me from getting further south and maybe getting to Carpinteria or getting further to a place that I really wanted to go see. It simply put, took away a day of riding away. So a bit of a low light in that sense, even though we had some fun with it. Number two, this one I want to talk about at a little greater length, and that is I had a bonk for the first time in my entire life. For those of you who don't know what bonking is, it is, I will try to describe it. I think that there are multiple causes for bonking, and they can be anywhere from not eating enough, not drinking enough, too much sun exposure. Maybe you are a little sick as well, overexertion, exhaustion. Throw all of those things together. I can only describe really how it ended up feeling. I felt really physically sick. This happened the day we were rolling into Santa Cruz, in the Santa Cruz area. I'm staying at New Brighton Beach State Park. And I actually had a very similar experience 2 years ago. I wouldn't call it the same thing. I think that I was just feeling a little gross from drinking way too much Gatorade 2 years ago, and just that fake sweetener that's in it. I'm finding that maybe I need to get away from it and drink it very minimally or water it down. This time, however, frankly, this was the first serious day of riding I've done this season. And I think that doing 55 miles on Brompton as your first tour, and you've got a winter's worth of stuff still, kind of shaking off that rust, plus a lot of more sun exposure than I anticipated. Well, it all conspired against me. So I didn't drink enough water, I think. I didn't eat enough food. The night before, when we were camping the first night, I had a little wine, which probably was not a great idea. And all these things that just sort of seemed like, hey, I can just jump right back into this thing. I ended up feeling really gross by the end of the ride. So we're on the outskirts of Santa Cruz, on the far side of Santa Cruz towards New Brighton Beach State Park. And we get to a grocery store. I think it was a Safeway. And James was going in to just get stuff for dinner. He was feeling fine, feeling okay, but he was hungry. He was like, I need to go get a bite to eat, like, immediately. And I locked the bikes up and I walked in a complete daze. I wasn't hungry. I wasn't thirsty, but at the same time, I was absolutely malnourished and dehydrated. And I don't know. I was walking around in a complete daze, and it was really off-putting because it was the first time that I felt real physical limits during a bike tour. And that's not a real challenging part of the ride right there. But how I felt was really sick. I walked around trying to find any kind of food. And I'm in a big Safeway. There was any kind of food that you could imagine was in that store, whether it was sweet or salty or whatever. I couldn't figure out what I wanted. Nothing appealed to me at all. And I knew that I needed to hydrate. I knew I needed to eat. And eventually I kind of was walking around and I was all set to get something from the deli, and I saw a teriyaki bowl. And for some reason, that was the only thing in that entire store that I was like, I think I can eat that. I think that seems like something I would like. So I got that, and I got a bottle of water, and I just forced myself. I don't know if any of you have ever had this happen to you before, where you are so sick, but you need to get something in you. You know that it has to get down. So dehydrated, but not thirsty. And I'm just sipping the smallest amounts, just trying to make it all work. It was a really miserable experience, and it took about an hour, but finally it started to get a little bit better. And, I credit just taking the time, taking the opportunity to eat even what I could and drink even what I could. And that really made all the difference in the world. What a horrible feeling. And I know that a lot of you out there have had this happen to you, and you try to avoid it as much as you can. I got some interesting feedback from folks. I don't have them in front of me. It basically saying essentially the same thing. Take time, rest, get fluids into you, do whatever it is that you need to. If you're cramping up, I wasn't cramping, then it probably means that you need electrolytes. So, the Gatorade or watered down Gatorade is one of those things. I've been using pills. They're specifically electrolyte pills. And those I swear by. A naturopathic doctor had prescribed them to me. They're not a prescription thing, but she had recommended them to me when I was first starting off on all of this. And I have used them ever since. And I think that just my experience again with these sports drinks that just don't agree with me very well. Your miles may vary, but they didn't agree with me very well at all. So I think I'm going to kind of leave the sports drinks behind largely and stick to these pills, because it allows me to drink just pure clean water in those, and that keeps my system kind of in check. So bottom line, it was probably the biggest low light of the entire trip was this bunk, and I slept like a rock that night. I really slept it off. Woke up the next morning and I was about 85, maybe 90%. It really took another full day until I got my legs underneath me, because that was where we ended up at Pfeiffer at Big Sur. And then that next night I slept pretty well, and we had the 0 mile day. We had all that rain the next day. And that really was the thing that kind of got me over the hump. It really took a while. And once you have such a huge systemic fail like that, it takes some time to get back in gear again. So take your time. listen to your body and make sure you do all those things that all the books and all the other podcasts and all the other things tell you. Drink before you're thirsty, eat before you're hungry. I think that's a pretty good deal. Don't force it, but don't withhold those things, because I'm here to tell you, you will bonk and it sucks. All right, next up on the lowlights list, breaking in a Brooks saddle for the first time on a bike tour. It wasn't the end of the world. I made a bigger deal of it, I think, on social media than it really was. I didn't have that bad of, shall we say, chafing or anything like that. But I would say I won the battle. My sits bones won the battle eventually. But I would recommend that if you're going to go on a tour, don't use a relatively new Brooks saddle. Make sure you ride around maybe 100 miles or so while you commute, or do something else in shorter spurts than doing a lot of riding on a tour with it. It was not ideal, but I will have to say I have a broken in Brooks saddle now, so it's pretty good. Definitely recommend you do that in other chunks, in other ways. Next couple of things were just little things. I mean, they were more inconveniences rather than, I would say, lowlights. But the first one was, so Game of Thrones, the new season started on Sunday, and we were in Morro Bay. And I was like, I think I do want to watch this first episode, and I have an HBO Now account. So I was like, oh, how much data can this possibly take? Well, it turns out it takes about 1 gig an hour. So I burnt quite a bit of data just watching that first episode. Was it worth it? Well, I guess it was all right. It was certainly interesting. I don't know if any of you watch Game of Thrones, but I got into it a few years ago, and it was just fun to be able to be watching that in a tent. So I guess in a sense, maybe it was all right. And I had the data plan to support that, but let's just say that I'll be downloading a lot of stuff on Wi-Fi for the rest of the month just because of that. So we'll call that a low light. Last but not least, this happened just actually last night when I was flying back. As we were getting ready to board the plane, the gate attendants were saying how they were going to be strictly measuring all bags coming on board. And I, of course, had Pearl, my Brompton, with me, and I know it fits in that type of overhead, and I know it works, but I also know that technically speaking, that bike does not meet the measurement standards for overhead bins on any airline. It's, I think, over by about 1 inch or 2 in one of the dimensions. And I was like, I just didn't want to have them say, stick that enormous thing inside this little box so that we can prove that it doesn't fit, even though I know it works. So I ended up gate checking it. I used the Dimpa bag, and thank you for all my Swedish correspondents out there, senior Swedish correspondents, for helping me with the translation of Dimpa. Oh, by the way, sidebar, James and I ran into, we think, 2 Swedish women who were traveling the coast in a car, and their accents suggested they were Swedish. And so he and I were sort of like, should I ask them also about this whole Dimpa thing? Just to get a third opinion. And I decided against it. It was probably a bad idea. Anyways, the Dimpa bag worked like a charm. The bike just fit right into it, even with its stealth cover on. And I walked right up to the desk there, and they had offered for anybody who would gate check any of their stuff that we would get on first. They said no problem. They said, oh, by the way, what is it? And I was like, it's kind of like a stroller, just because I didn't want that. I wanted to say the magic B word and have them go, it's a bike? Well, that will be $150,000, sir. Anyways, so kind of like a stroller, I think, is not technically a lie. Maybe it's a slight fib. Okay, maybe it's a lie. But anyways, it got gate checked. I worried about it the entire flight. We went through the worst turbulence on the way across, and all I could think of was the bike getting slammed against the bulkhead inside the aircraft. But when I got back to DC, got off the plane, it was waiting for me on the not at the tarmac, but in the gateway there, the jetway. And wasn't a scratch on it. The bag looked pristine, and I opened it up and everything looked great. So gate checking does work. I'm sure it's something that I will try to avoid in the future. But now that I've done it once, I think that the last barrier is gone now for me in terms of my fears of flying with the Brompton. And I'll talk a lot more about it. I might even do some more videos. I think I'm going to be doing a YouTube channel for Pedalshift, by the way. That's a soft reveal right there. And just showing some of the different ways that I'm doing these types of things, whether it's on the full-size bike or on the Brompton or whatever, just to visualize a lot of it, because I realize the audio medium isn't necessarily ideal for everything. So anyways, that's a sidebar. And, even though the bike got through no problem, I still have to call it a bit of a low light just for the worrying factor for the 4.5 hours that I was in the air. But it worked out all right. Lessons. I had a few great takeaways from this trip, and I thought I'd share them with you and this goes beyond just the highlights and the lowlights that I've been mentioning here. Number one is I'm glad that I brought a stove with me. I think I had mentioned on the last show that I wasn't going to bring a stove, or I was teetering back and forth. I brought the Espit titanium stove, which folds up. It fits in the palm of your hand. It's really small and burns alcohol cubes, for lack of a better word. They smell terrible, but they work great. And it was good to have. We didn't do it every morning, but it was nice to be able to make some Via coffee, those Starbucks packets. We did that. That worked really well. And it was just a good option to have. Having coffee in the morning is just sort of what I like about camping. And I think bringing a stove of some type is a good idea. I think I'm going to be doing it for most trips. Maybe an overnight trip or a weekend trip, maybe I'll set it aside, but I think it's nice to have. So I'm glad I brought it. And that was just a lesson that is sort of like, I'm more of a bring a stove kind of guy than a not bring a stove kind of guy. Bigger lesson, rain gear. I looked at the forecast and I sort of went with what my history had said and my experience had said, that the California coast at this time of year doesn't really get a lot of rain. Well, the answer is actually it does get some rain. And I think that I played it really fast and loose by basically brought a windbreaker. I didn't even bring my full rain gear kit. And frankly, I have kind of lousy rain gear. And after the experience that we had on the 0 mile day, we were kind of lucky that the rain forecast and the information that I had gave me the ability to call it before the rain really started. If we had been out there on the road and that rain had hit, I know I would have been really uncomfortable. I would have made it. It would have been fine, but it would have been really uncomfortable and not very cool. So my big takeaway from all of this is, frankly, if you're on a longer tour, you should have rain gear and you should bring it with you every time. And when all is said and done, I'm probably going to be making an investment in some nicer rain gear. I know Showers Pass makes some good stuff. And, if anybody has some suggestions, I would love to hear it, especially all you Northwest types. You are the kings and queens of handling rain. So please, if you've got suggestions, I would love to hear what your recommendations would be for touring. Light windbreakers, frankly, just not enough. We were really fortunate that we missed out on that really heavy cold rain. So, I'm going to bring it every time if there's a chance for rain on the tour. And for most of my tours, that's most of the time, most of my tours. So rain gear every time. It's not that big. It's not that bulky. Just bring it. Last lesson was something that I experimented with, offline maps. I know that Google Maps now does offline versions for iOS and has done it for Android for quite some time, but I was messing around with something called Map Out. It's an app on iOS, and there are other ones available for Android as well. They allow you to download, slivers of your route. But the other thing that was cool with it is that I found a gentleman who had provided the GPS lines for, and I wish I could remember the names of these actual files. If you're a GPS user, a standalone GPS user, you probably know them. But they are the files for the ACA, the American Cycling Association Pacific Coast route, but also all of them. And I now have all of the ACA routes in my phone, which is kind of cool. And I can download offline versions of maps, which zoom into very good resolution and with, all streets involved. The routes don't track specifically with it, with the roads, but you can tell exactly pretty much where they are. The waypoints are where the turns have to be. So if the line isn't exactly on the road that you're on, you can figure out what road you're supposed to be on. It worked really well, and I used it on several occasions, even when I did have a signal, but it was particularly helpful when I didn't have a signal. But it was just good to be able to take a quick glance and know, all right, I know I'm on the right route. There are a few sections in some of the rural parts of this ride where you're going through agricultural areas, and 2 years ago, they weren't very well signed. This year, they were better signed, but I just remembered that I almost got lost 2 years ago, so I used the offline map option to just make double sure that I was going in the right direction to confirm the signs were correct. And it was, and it worked. And I did miss one turn at one point, which actually didn't have a sign. And I was on a pretty gnarly stretch of freeway section
Highway 1. And luckily, only had to go one exit worth, but it was nicely wide-shouldered and everything, and it worked out all right. And that was actually right before I met up with MJ and met Tim and all of that. So offline maps, when I used them, they worked really well. When I should have used it and missed a turn, I regretted it. But I'm really glad that I had it, and I think that's a good lesson, is to have some offline map available for you. Even if you're a tech guy like me and love using your phone, having something that's available offline is really, really important. I highly recommend it. So that's basically it for the tour here. It was a really good time. I know I'm going to do it again. I highly recommend the California coast. I hope that everybody out there who has the gumption and the interest in doing it will go out there and do it. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net. Lots of great content. You can hear the Pedalshift project through iTunes or your favorite podcast aggregator. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his debut album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Habitat, wherever cool music is available.